college sports have changed fundamentally over the past year. In the past, the amateur status of the NCAA's athletes has prevented them from taking pretty much any money from their athletic performance. The likes of USC, Ole Miss, and even my own beloved Alabama Crimson Tide have been heavily penalized in the past for violations related specifically to paying players. But these days, if a player rolls up to practice in a Porsche, no one's immediately getting on the phone to the NCAA. They'd just be like, well, that's Caleb. He's making as much as a brain surgeon now. And let me just say right here that I think all of that is completely fine. I think that college athletes getting paid for the use of their image and likeness has been overdue for quite a while. And as dumb as I think it was for it not to have happened sooner, the story of how we got to this point is even dumber. Because it wasn't like the NCAA just decided one day that it was okay with its athletes being able to accept money. Believe me, they're not that kind of organization. No, like a pimple that just wouldn't pop, the NCAA resisted and resisted for years, until finally there was enough pressure for them to relent. And weirdly enough, the final push that got NIL over the line and allowed collegiate athletes to be paid for their likeness didn't happen because of Bryce Young or Jalen Suggs or Suni Lee. It happened because of this guy, Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. And if that seems confusing to you, then get in line and buckle up, because we got a lot of ground to cover, both figuratively and literally. If you're like me and you've played a few thousand hours worth of video games based on college sports, you probably remember playing with some of your favorite players. Well, not technically. It was always like quarterback number 15 or whatever, but anyone with even a casual knowledge of the sport would see the character rendered in the game and be like, yeah, that's Tim Tebow. The video game guy had the same number, same skill set, and even all the same physical attributes as the real person. The only thing missing was the name, because that's the part you usually have to pay people for, and at the time, that wasn't allowed. So EA Sports and the NCAA went forward with the honestly way more brazen strategy of just putting the player's likeness in the game without their legal permission, because who's going to call them out on it, right? And for the most part, that kind of went unaddressed. The idea of NIL, which stands for name, image, and likeness, was but a twinkle in the eye of the NCAA's athletes. And even though the NCAA and video game companies were already profiting off those things, it would stay that way for an uncomfortably long time. But all of that changed in 2009, when former UCLA basketball player Ed O'Bannon filed a class action lawsuit along with 20 other former college athletes, including NBA Hall of Famers Bill Russell and Oscar Robertson, alleging that the NCAA had violated both their right to publicity and the Sherman Antitrust Act. And as hard as the NCAA pushed back against them, which they did, both the District Court and the Supreme Court agreed with O'Bannon. EA Sports and the Collegiate Licensing Committee agreed to a $40+ million settlement that gave money to more than 100,000 former athletes. And, not coincidentally, EA stopped making college sports games pretty much overnight because they didn't want to be sued anymore. So that's it, right? The NCAA eats some humble pie and lots of people get some well-earned money. Hooray! Well, yes and no. The O'Bannon case helped answer the question of how to deal with players' likenesses that had already been featured in video games. But it didn't answer the much bigger question of how name, image, and likeness rules were going to be handled going forward. That was very much still up in the air, but the O'Bannon case did prove that there was a weakness in the NCAA's defenses, one that a couple of lawmakers were very eager to try and exploit. Fast forward to 2019, when California State Senator Nancy Skinner introduced Senate Bill 206, otherwise known as the Fair Pay to Play Act, which would allow college athletes to accept endorsement deals while also maintaining their eligibility. The plan, which was enthusiastically endorsed by California Governor and former collegiate baseball player Gavin Newsom, was to try and squeeze the NCAA by passing laws like this in as many states as possible. The bill flew through the California State Senate, and while it still had its opponents, the key point that Skinner and her co-writers made in this argument was shifting the discussion from one of a monetary issue to a civil rights issue. And this was incredibly effective. After the bill passed in California, similar bills passed in 12 other states over the next 2 years. But the NCAA wasn't having any of it. They threatened that they wouldn't let universities in California compete for championships if they went through with the bill, and even went as far as calling it unconstitutional. To which the Supreme Court said, unconstitutional, you say? We'll be the judge of that. Get it? Because they're all, you know what, never mind. The Supreme Court and the NCAA have been doing this little dance around each other for like 40 years, starting all the way back in 1984. For a long time, the NCAA completely controlled the television market for college football, because according to them, if people could just watch the games on TV, they wouldn't actually go to them. Today, we can recognize that as being pretty dumb, but at the time, schools weren't allowed to play on TV more than a couple of times per season, and had to split the revenue they generated from those games with the NCAA. But as you might expect, the schools did not love this, and in 1977, 63 of them came together to form the College Football Association, pretty much exclusively so they could negotiate their own TV deals with broadcasters. When the NCAA threatened those schools with sanctions if they went through with it, because of course they did, two of its member institutions, Oklahoma and Georgia, sued them. And it was on. The fundamental argument in the case between the NCAA and the Oklahoma Board of Regents was over whether or not the NCAA's stance on its member schools' TV deals violated antitrust laws. Going all the way back to the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, the U.S. has stringent laws against any kind of corporate behavior that would be considered anti-competitive, and especially anything that might be moving towards a monopoly. And because the NCAA were functionally controlling what their schools could and couldn't earn from TV deals, that's exactly what those schools said they were doing. And the Supreme Court agreed. They sided with the universities, which opened the door for major football programs to negotiate lucrative contracts with broadcasters and start making real money, which they did. The athletes didn't, but we'll come back to that in a bit. But aside from the TV deals themselves, the other major legacy of the Oklahoma Board of Regents case was the precedent it set about the nature of college sports. Buried within the court's decision was language that basically said that amateurism was a bedrock principle of the NCAA's model. And while antitrust laws applied automatically to pro leagues like the NFL, the NCAA was a little different. And while that wasn't fundamental to the ruling in that particular case, the NCAA took that language about amateurism and beat down any sort of challenge to athletes getting paid for the next, 30 years. It wasn't until the Ed O'Bannon case that they showed any real weakness on that stance. But once they did, the opportunity to take a swing at getting college athletes paid was there for the taking. Enter Alston versus NCAA, a continuation of the O'Bannon case, where the issue at hand wasn't so much whether or not the athletes could or would be paid, because that wasn't really on the table yet, but what kind of compensation their scholarships could cover. Instead of just tuition and room and board and the rest of the regular scholarship deal, Alston wanted to push the boundaries on things like computers or paid internships. You know, the stuff available to literally everyone else. Attorney Jeffrey Kessler wanted athletes to be able to benefit sooner rather than later, but even with a bunch of states passing pay-to-play legislation, he and his team knew that filing another lawsuit related specifically to NIL would start the whole process over from the district level, which could take years. So they went forward with Alston and challenged the NCAA's assertion that expanding the kind of benefits that athletes would receive would destroy the idea of amateurism. Because once again, that same idea, the one that was first established in the 1984 Oklahoma Board of Regents case, was at the heart of the NCAA's argument. If athletes could accept forms of academic compensation outside of a scholarship, what was stopping Nike from giving someone an internship for $500,000 a year? The NCAA didn't think a hypothetical like that was in keeping with the whole idea of being a student athlete, and not for the first time, that was the hill they were willing to die on. Only this time, they actually did. Not only did the court side with Alston and Kessler over the NCAA, but they did so unanimously. And as if that wasn't enough of a win for Kessler and the athletes, one justice took that decision a step further. Justice Brett Kavanaugh decided to write his own opinion of the case, separate from the one written by Neil Gorsuch that explained the ruling. And he did not hold back. While he never actually mentions NIL in that opinion, Kavanaugh absolutely went in on the NCAA's go-to defense against it. The idea that paying student athletes was against the idea of amateurism. All of the restaurants in a region, Kavanaugh wrote, can't come together to cut cooks' wages on the theory that customers prefer to eat food from low-paid cooks. He used a couple of other examples, but to avoid this just turning into me reading his opinion, I'll put a link to the whole thing in the description. But to sum it up, he argued that the NCAA's notion of athletes only playing for the love of the game being baked into their business model was kind of nonsense. And this opinion, which was completely voluntary, by the way, he definitely didn't have to go as hard as he did, took the NCAA out at the knees. It's important to reiterate here that Alston wasn't Kavanaugh or the Supreme Court saying NIL is legal now. What they were saying is that despite the NCAA's protestations to the contrary, they couldn't be exempt from antitrust laws just because their athletes were amateurs. If any other industry tried something like that, Kavanaugh wrote, it would be considered flatly illegal, and it was time for the NCAA to hold itself to the same standard. Basically, he told them that they weren't special anymore, and that if anyone else wanted to come challenge that amateurism argument that they'd been using for so long, say for something like a name, image, and likeness law, then the Supreme Court would probably rule in their favor. And indirectly, that actually was the thing that pushed NIL over the line. States around the country were continuing to pass pay-to-play bills, and with this ruling, the NCAA couldn't do much to stop them. What were they going to do? Threaten to kick the schools out? All of them? Not after Alston, they weren't. The language from the Oklahoma Board of Regents case back in 1984 was the Jenga block that the NCAA had been using to prop up their tower for such a long time. And with it gone, the whole thing kind of came crumbling down. After years of failed attempts, in the year of our Lord 2022, NCAA athletes can finally profit off their name, image, and likeness. But in the end, it wasn't just one bill, one case, or one person that brought NIL into existence. The years-long legislative efforts from politicians like Nancy Skinner and Gavin Newsom, as well as earlier lawsuits like the O'Bannon case, set the table for Alston to be decided the way it was, and for Brett Kavanaugh to defend it the way he did. In basketball terms, Skinner, Newsom, and O'Bannon tossed up the alley, and Brett Kavanaugh in the Supreme Court threw down the oop. And just as an aside, the idea of a conservative Supreme Court justice providing the icing on the political cake for two liberal Californian lawmakers is kind of insane. But sometimes that's what it takes, and honestly, it kind of proves the biggest takeaway for me. The meat and potatoes of the Alston case was the highest court in the land saying that the core of the NCAA's entire argument was a bunch of nonsense. Because it was, and it was the whole time. They held off the tide for as long as they could, but in the end, the NCAA's insistence that its athletes were amateurs, all while the schools and coaches that they played for made millions, was so wrong that it transcended traditional political divisions. And we should let that be a lesson. No matter how you try to dress it up, if the core of your argument is a load of crap, it will get found out eventually, whether that takes 40 minutes or 40 years. In any case, the NIL era is here, and it doesn't seem like it's going to end anytime soon. And as they're out signing endorsement deals and buying cars or whatever else people with money do, the players benefiting from it would do well to remember the years of work that so many people, from the 1980s to now, from Oklahoma to California to Washington, D.C., put in to make it happen. Hey everybody, thanks so much for sticking around until the end of the video. It means a lot. I'm Will, and I'm really hoping that all the hours I spent watching Legal Eagle videos came through in this episode. If you did like the content, be sure to give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more stuff like it. And if you really liked it, you can sign up to my Patreon page using the link in the description and get some bonus content on this exact same topic next week. If you couldn't tell, I think this whole topic is super interesting and really loved getting to tear into it for this episode. We'll have another video for you next week, which I'm off to go work on now. So until next time, I'm Will. Thanks so much for watching.